So first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody back who was in this afternoon's session earlier with our colleagues from EMLA and N3B. And for those of you who are watching by video, I know when we came to public comment time, you saw us at the dais. Our N3B and EMLA colleagues were here. They just chose to sit in the audience during that time period. So they did stay, and they actually had some good dialogue with some of our citizens after that session. So I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that. Also, for housekeeping, since our NSA and colleagues from LANL weren't here earlier, we have exhibits that we'll be showing on the screen that we've entered into the record. There's 37 of them, so just a few. And we also have posted an acronym listing and a glossary of key terms to help the public better understand our the conversation this afternoon. Those documents, as well as all the exhibits, are available on our website, dnfsb.gov, and are accessible through the QR code. So if you want to help those of you at home want to follow along, that's how you would do that. And again, I would just want to thank everybody for coming back. I don't recognize any other public officials except thank you, Councilman Hanson or Commissioner Hanson for returning. I appreciate that. Ann Hanson is the County Commissioner from District 2. She was with us this afternoon as well. And if there are any other elected officials that I should be recognizing? Okay, seeing none. I'm going to call us to order for session 2. For those of you who missed our introductions from session 1, my name is Joyce Connery, and I'm the chair of the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board. With me are Vice Chair Thomas Summers and Board Member Jesse Roberson. We also have Chris Rossetti, our Technical Director, and Eric Fox, who is our Associate General Counsel. Our goals for this evening are to gather information on the production activities to be conducted at the plutonium facility, the nuclear safety risks that the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, has accepted, and the state of planned safety improvements to the safety systems, infrastructure, and safety programs. Once we finish our question sessions with NNSA, we'll hear from any interested members of the public at approximately 8:45 this evening. If you would like to speak during the public comment portion but did not contact us ahead of time, there's a sign-up sheet at the table next to the door, and we encourage you to do so. And again, if you have any comments or anything that you would like to submit for the record, you can do that as well. I believe the record will be open until December 16th, so there'll be time if you have other comments that you want to share. For these next 2 sessions, we're thrilled to be joined tonight by our counterparts from NNSA who have supported this hearing process. We appreciate this cooperation from NNSA. It's a reflection of a healthy working relationship that currently exists between our agency and NNSA. I would say the relations were a little more adversarial a few years back, but we've mutually recognized the need for a more constructive relationship and worked together to implement a memorandum of understanding earlier this year, which has helped to improve our relationship. We look forward to continuing this dynamic work to solve some of the Defense Nuclear Complex's most intractable challenges, including those here at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Like I said during the session, we're looking to understand the safety posture of the LANL's plutonium facility called PF4. As we will discuss, PF4 is vital to our national security and it is imperative that work in this facility be accomplished both safely and securely. This will present NNSA with challenges, first and foremost because PF4 was neither designed nor historically operated as a large-scale production facility. PF4 is now over 40 years old, and it's showing its age in many ways, like many of us. This is likely not news to anyone in this room. We've explored these topics in a public forum for many years, including a public hearing in 2017. Despite this age, NNSA is going to be relying on PF4 to continue its mission work and even take on additional scope for the next several decades. A great deal of work is needed, both in terms of physical upgrades and culture shifts, to change the paradigm from laboratory-scale research and development to full-scale pit production. Tonight, we are hoping to hear about the progress NNSA has made on these fronts. First, with physical upgrades, we'll spend some time discussing the active confinement ventilation system. There's been a long history of communications back and forth between the board and NNSA on this subject. For more than a decade, NNSA had planned to make upgrades to the components such that the system as a whole could be credited as a safety class control, which means it could be counted upon reliably to protect members of the public in the event of a bounding earthquake. In March of this year, NNSA informed the board that it no longer seeks these upgrades to achieve a safety class system. One of our objectives tonight is to understand why. But this hearing is not just about the ventilation system. Many other aspects, safety-related infrastructure, such as aging and other deficiencies, are also in need of attention. We've been talking about the fire suppression system as well as glove boxes in which workers perform operations with nuclear materials for as long as we've been talking about ventilation. Apart from the physical changes to the facility, PF4 will also experience a step change in operational scope. PF4 will be required to process more nuclear material with more workers than ever before. NNSA and its contractor, Triad National Security, will have their hands full attracting, training, and retaining the workforce necessary to accomplish this mission safely. And this mission is drastically increasing in both the near term and the long term. In August of this year, we sent NNSA a letter detailing our concerns with the expansion of operations with heat source plutonium. In addition, we are looking to understand NNSA's perspective as to how it will expand pit production operations in light of the fact that the facility still relies heavily on a passive confinement strategy for nuclear materials, a topic of another letter of ours that the staff will speak to separately. So as you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover and many complex topics to discuss. To help facilitate this discussion today, we have prepared exhibits to be displayed on the screen for the benefit of the members of the public. Again, we've listed acronyms and a glossary term to help you understand our discussions. These materials are available on our website, and you can use the QR code that we've provided at the door. So at this time, I want to turn to my fellow board members for their opening remarks, and I will start with Vice Chair Summers.
Thank you, Chair Connery. Hello and good evening. For those of you that missed the first session, let me reintroduce myself. My name is Tom Summers, and I am the Vice Chair of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. I'm excited to be here today and want to welcome and thank the panelists and the interested public for attending this hearing today. Similar to the first session, in my statement, I will cover the positive developments that we are seeing at PF4 and the topics that we have interest in but do not have the time to address tonight. So regarding the good news, I'm happy to note that the amount of transuranic waste staged outside of PF4 has been significantly reduced over the last few years. This is important because, unlike other storage options available at the laboratory, outdoor storage locations do not provide any additional protection in the event of the release of radioactive material from a waste container. Structures such as PF4 or the transuranic waste facility include fire suppression and confinement systems to help prevent or mitigate potential radiological release events. Like the accidents DOE experienced at WIP in 2014 and Idaho National Laboratory in 2018. The laboratory has also completed several structural upgrades and earthquake studies for the plutonium facility. This increases confidence in the ability of the building to survive a major earthquake. Speaking of upgrades, NNSA's contractor, Triad National Security, is in the process of upgrading the plutonium facility's safety basis to meet modern DOE requirements. This upgrade is scheduled to be submitted to NNSA for approval next year. This upgrade is important because the modern safety standards have improved clarity with respect to safety expectations and requirements, such that following them provides added assurance that the facility can be safely operated. I also want to highlight the strides that Triad and NNSA Los Alamos Field Office have made in hiring new personnel. However, we also know that they have a long way to go to meeting their staffing goals, both for operational staff and for safety personnel. Finally, I would like to mention the topics that the board has continued interest in, but will not be able to cover tonight during this session. Number one, on-site transportation, which was the subject of a recent board letter. We have received the Department of Energy's response, and we are currently evaluating it. Number two, other NNSA facilities at Los Alamos, including PF400, also known as the Radiological Laboratory Utility Office Building, or RULOB, and the Transuranic Waste Facility. Number 3, emergency drills and exercises. And finally, number 4, the LANL Environmental Impact Statement. We know that many of you are interested in the LANL Environmental Impact Statement, but the board is not a participant in this process. Thank you, Ms. Connery, for giving me the opportunity to speak. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Ms. Robertson, would you like to make any opening remarks at this time?
Thank you, Chair Connery. I'm going to bypass opening comments at this time.
Thank you, ma'am. So before we hear from NNSA, I'm going to ask that our technical director, Mr. Chris Rossetti, give you a statement describing the views of our staff and explaining some of the concepts that we'll be talking about this evening. So I will turn it over to Mr. Rossetti.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss PF4 at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I want to provide background information to assist the public in understanding today's hearing. PF4 is the nation's primary plutonium processing facility, meaning that it is responsible for producing plutonium components, called pits, for nuclear weapons, disposing of excess plutonium, and fabricating components for other entities, such as NASA. To understand how to safely operate the facility while completing this mission, NNSA's contractor, Triad National Security, prepares documents called a safety basis. In the safety basis, Triad identifies potential accidents and evaluates the consequences of those accidents. For higher consequence accidents, Triad will then identify safety controls to prevent and/or mitigate the consequences of those accidents. At PF4, the most challenging accident is a severe earthquake that also causes a fire. The calculated dose consequences from this bounding accident scenario would exceed the Department of Energy's evaluation guideline of 25 rem total effective dose to the off-site public. By the department's own requirements, exceeding the evaluation guideline means that safety class controls, or controls relied upon to protect the public, must be put in place. These controls must be constructed to rigorous criteria to ensure they will perform their safety functions when necessary. The primary control that NNSA relies upon to lower the calculated dose consequence for PF4 is passive confinement, which uses the building structure to reduce the amount of radioactive material released to the environment. This concept is illustrated in Exhibit 10. Any doors, cracks, or other openings in the facility are pathways for radioactive material to escape. The fraction of airborne radioactive material that escapes through these pathways is referred to as the leak path factor. For the bounding earthquake and fire event, NNSA determined that the passive confinement control reduces the calculated dose consequence to slightly below the DOE evaluation guideline. But this calculated dose consequence is dependent on PF4's external doors only being open for a total of 5 minutes to evacuate the entire PF4 workforce. NNSA also plans to upgrade additional safety class engineered controls, including the fire suppression system, to further mitigate the release. According to NNSA's March 2022 letter to the board, NNSA determined that the combined effect of these additional controls will reduce the mitigated dose consequence to about 7 rem once they are completed. However, the PF4 safety basis identifies multiple existing deficiencies in the ventilation and fire suppression systems that may prevent them from performing their intended functions during an accident. The board members plan to explore this further today. I will talk about equipment performance in an earthquake using the example in Exhibit 11. Equipment designated as Performance Category 3, or PC3, is considered able to reliably perform its safety function through a bounding earthquake. At the next lower level, the systems and components designated as PC2 are analyzed and designed to operate following a less severe earthquake. Sometimes equipment requires upgrades to ensure it can be relied upon at the designated category. For example, in Exhibit 11, we can see additional bracing added to secure electrical equipment. On the left, we can see electrical cabinets before upgrades. On the right, the yellow arrows point to additional bracing for a seismic event. Exhibit 12 shows some of the history of correspondence between the board and the department regarding PF4 during the past 2 decades. In recommendation 2004-2, active confinement systems, the board outlined the drawbacks of relying upon passive confinement systems. PF4 is the only major NNSA facility with plutonium dispersal hazards to rely upon passive confinement as the primary credited safety control to protect the public. While passive confinement provides some mitigation in the case of an accident, active confinement ventilation systems mitigate accidents in a different and more effective way. These systems use fans to ensure that air moves into the facility through doors and leak paths, not out. The system fans direct contaminated air through high-efficiency particulate air filters, or HEPA filters, capturing the radioactive contaminants. PF4's active confinement ventilation system is classified as PC2, while the passive confinement system is classified as PC3. Later on the timeline, the board issued recommendation 2009-2, Los Alamos National Laboratory Plutonium Facility Seismic Safety. This recommendation described deficiencies in the safety basis at PF4 specifically. The board's major concern was that the calculated dose consequences for the bounding seismic event were much higher than the DOE evaluation guideline, even after the application of safety controls. In response to this recommendation, the Secretary of Energy committed to a strategy to ensure that the mitigated dose for bounding earthquakes at PF4 will not exceed the evaluation guideline. This strategy involves strengthening the facility structure. Pictured in the upper half of Exhibit 12 are seismic upgrades being completed over the years, including carbon fiber reinforcement of structural concrete, and more recently, columns undergoing seismic testing. NNSA originally planned to upgrade the active confinement ventilation system to be safety class NPC3, resolve seismic deficiencies for the firewater loop, and replace the aging fire alarm system as part of the TA-55 reinvestment project phase 3. NNSA eventually shifted strategies and elected to pursue piecemeal upgrades to components in the ventilation system, but with the same planned end state. However, as the chair discussed in her statement in March of this year, NNSA informed the board that it no longer seeks these upgrades to achieve a safety class PC3 system. In a November 2019 board letter, and again in Technical Report 44, LANL Plutonium Facility Leak Path Factor Methodology, the board identified concerns with PF4's accident analysis methods. These calculate how much radioactive material escapes PF4 in the bounding accident. There are many complicated assumptions in the leak path factor calculations, such as the amount of time that the exit doors will remain open while workers are evacuating the facility. Finally, on August 11, 2022, the board issued 2 letters outlining the board's concerns regarding leak path factor calculations and NNSA's acceptance of higher risks using the exigent circumstances process to repackage large quantities of heat source plutonium. The board members will explore these topics later today. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. I know that was a lot, but we wanted to make sure that we set the stage so that everybody understood the direction of the questions and how we were going to approach this today. So I'd like to introduce our NNSA panel today. So joining us are Administrator Jill Ruby, James McConnell, the Associate Deputy Principal Administrator of NNSA, Mr. Ted Wyka, Manager of the Los Alamos Field Office, and Dr. Tom Mason, the Laboratory Director at Los Alamos. The board set aside a few minutes for NNSA to provide an opening statement, so I'd like to recognize the administrator for her opening statement before we proceed to our questioning.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Connery, Ms. Roberson, and Mr. Summers for your comments, and welcome to all the members of the public here and virtually attending today. I appreciate the opportunity to be back in Santa Fe and have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the NNSA to address our mission priorities and associated operations at Los Alamos. First, let me start by thanking the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board and the staff for their professionalism and commitment to nuclear safety. I'm certain that the work that we do in NNSA is better because of your input. While we don't necessarily agree on all matters, there's no question in my mind about that. As noted in the recently released Biden administration nuclear posture review, we find ourselves at a time in history when the United States needs to have a strong nuclear deterrent coupled with leadership in arms control and nuclear nonproliferation. The priorities at Los Alamos and throughout the nuclear security enterprise are responsive to those laid out in the nuclear posture review. NNSA's work to support nuclear deterrence has two primary and interrelated priorities. One is to refurbish and modernize our nuclear stockpile, and the other is to recapitalize and revitalize the infrastructure needed for both the stockpile modernization programs and the related science and nonproliferation missions. These priorities are interrelated because the timing for the infrastructure work is driven by the stockpile requirements. In the near term and in the long term, the goal is to create a resilient and adaptive production enterprise. A resilient and adaptive enterprise would not have single points of failure and would be able to be scaled either up or down as world conditions drive U.S. policy changes. I would like to make a few specific comments about PIP production at Los Alamos since it is central to NNSA priorities and to this meeting today. The Los Alamos National Laboratory Plutonium Facility 4, commonly referred to as PF4, within Technical Area 55, or TA 55, is currently the only facility authorized to produce plutonium pits in the United States. This makes Los Alamos and our work there vital to NNSA's requirement to produce a minimum of 80 plutonium pits per year as close to 2030 as possible. The specific objective at Los Alamos is to be able to reliably produce at least 30 pits per year. We are building another facility at the Savannah River site to produce a minimum of 50 pits per year reliably. Our efforts to prepare PF4 for its production mission are emblematic of our efforts across the nuclear security enterprise, pairing new and revitalized infrastructure capable of handling our expanded mission requirements with improved safety equipment and resilience measures. In this way, we are fulfilling our obligations to meet mission requirements with our commitment to be good employers, strong stewards of the environment, and close partners with local communities. In addition to investing in upgrades to PF4 safety equipment to further support safe operations, we are undertaking a complete revision of the PF4 documented safety analysis that will provide updated analysis to validate safety controls. Of course, in addition to the infrastructure and safety upgrades, we need a dedicated, qualified, and in some cases specialized workforce to achieve our mission and the best operational performance. We have made recruitment and retention a top priority so that we can meet our obligations today while building institutional knowledge and preparation for the challenge of tomorrow. Overall, while we face a challenging mission, we feel we are headed in the right direction. Our intent is to follow all applicable safety, security, and environmental rules and regulations, seek continuous improvement, and meet our national security obligations. Thank you very much, and we look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Thank you, Administrator. We're going to add that written statement to our record, and of course, if you have any other documentation or information that you'd like to add to the record, like we said, we're going to keep the record open until December 16th. So if anything else comes up during the hearing that prompts you to do so, let us know. So with the time remaining, of course, the board has a couple questions. why we're here. So I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chair to ask the first question. And I want to start the session with the question to the administrator because it has to do a lot with what you said in your opening statement and a holistic discussion of NNSA's national security missions, PIT production, heat source plutonium processing, and ensuring a safe deterrent. So NNSA is planning for a portion of important national security work to be accomplished in PF4, as we've already discussed, and PF4 is already 44 years old. And this work is expected to extend the need for PF4 for at least several more decades. As of now, PF4 hasn't given up any of its mission, but NNSA has other facilities that could potentially handle plutonium processing after some upgrades. For example, facilities at the Nevada National Security Site, or the new pit production facility that you were discussing at Savannah River. Exhibit 13 shows these facilities and provides some information about their proximity to the public. Additionally, I just want to point out that the highest hazard operations in PF4 aren't necessarily pit production. It's associated with the heat source plutonium rather than pit manufacturing. The consequences of an accident involving heat source plutonium are about 200 times worse than individuals than the plutonium involved in pit manufacturing. As you can see from Exhibit 14, in our 2017 hearing, Mr. McConnell discussed the concept to remove these activities and other high-risk activities and put them in new modular facilities with a modern nuclear safety system. This, from a safety standpoint, makes a lot of sense, but I understand it's potentially cost prohibitive. So with that in mind, my questions for you, Administrator, about what, as the Administrator across the enterprise, what have you considered the possibility of transferring some of the work beyond the scope already designated for Savannah River to other locations to alleviate the burden at PF4? And, based on the commentary from Mr. McConnell in 2017, does NNSA have any current thinking on moving heat source plutonium mission or other high hazard work to new facilities, or is that outside of the scope? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's very well posed. So let me make some comments about, you have shown the sort of three options of existing facilities that we would have to do plutonium work. And in fact, we do plutonium work at all of those facilities. Previous administrations made well-considered decisions about the two-site pit production strategy. One of the things we know is that we need to move, we feel those were good decisions, and we need to move on with those decisions, and I've endorsed that, and the Secretary of Energy has endorsed that approach. And that is our primary focus in these facilities, is to make, and any of our plutonium facilities, is to make sure that we're able to make new pits at the rate we need to. There are other plutonium activities, and they come, of course, with the risk of handling plutonium. I've worked closely with the lab. We are looking at how to scope all of that so that it works holistically. I think we've made great progress in that, looking at the facility holistically as opposed to one mission at a time. We are not today planning or funding additional facilities to handle heat source plutonium. This is the facility. Again, it is in the best interest of the United States, in my opinion, to not proliferate plutonium facilities, to use the plutonium facilities we have as efficiently, as effectively, and as safely as possible. And our judgment is today that heat sources and PF4 make sense from that perspective. There's a lot of things that are going to happen over the next couple decades, and I couldn't predict whether we need to relook that, but today we're trying to utilize the facilities we have as efficiently, effectively, and safely as possible, and that's the basis for the decisions that we've made in this administration and previous administrations.
Thank you. That's exactly the information that we were looking for. So I'm going to turn the questioning over to Ms. Roberson for the next series of questions.
Thank you, Chair Connery. Recently, NNSA accepted a mission, which you've referred to already, Administrator, a mission for PF4 that involves receiving large quantities of heat source plutonium that requires repackaging. Triad has conservatively calculated that dose consequence from accidents involving this material are above what is normally allowed per DOE safety standards. NNSA has accepted this risk using a process known as exigent circumstances. This activity supports space exploration projects such as the Perseverance rover, now on Mars, shown in the left side of Exhibit 15. On the right side of the exhibit, we see fuel storage out of containers. These are welded containers that Triad workers will repackage the heat source plutonium into for safe storage. The board discussed this planned activity in a recent letter to the Secretary of Energy. We pointed out that NNSA and Triad could have made different decisions, such as making upgrades to engineered safety systems in PF4 to reduce the safety risks associated with this activity. So my question is to you, Mr. McConnell, first. NNSA should take, we believe NNSA should take all feasible actions to avoid the need to apply the exigent circumstances process. While it would have been difficult for NNSA to completely avoid using the exigent circumstances process for this activity, NNSA could have reduced safety risks if it had coordinated the activity better. With your strong leadership role in safety and your position in safety in NNSA, how did you balance risk with completing this activity?
Thank you. A very good question. First off, by its very name, exigent conditions, we completely agree with you that this is a decision regime that should not be needed very often. And it is intentionally set up to be one for the name isn't particularly useful to tell folks what it is to add additional layers of review, more senior review in the department to make sure that all options that are available in these rare instances where an operation would exceed the evaluation guideline are duly considered, and I'm one of those additional layers of review. Your point is well taken, obviously, that we would like to have systems and controls in place at PF4, at any facility that accepts hazardous work, to make sure that there is a margin between what our safety systems can control within evaluation guidelines and the hazards that we accept in the facility. That's our goal at PF4, that's our goal everywhere. The problem we faced here was one of timing. The time need to deal with a hazard, which I won't get into additional detail, but there was a safety benefit to timely processing of this hazard against the time it takes to create the physical controls that would allow us to operate within our normal safety basis. We looked at the operation, the laboratory, and the field office in particular, the normal risk acceptance methodology, to take every opportunity to use not only the controls that are physically available in PF4, but what we call administrative controls, which are additional controls that we can put in place that affect processes and things like material at risk, or how much material could be processed or be available to be involved in a hazardous event at any one time. Put controls on those things to use the full suite of our ability to mitigate hazards, but still meet the timeline because of the safety benefit of acting quickly. So we made the right decisions. I was one of the people that approved the exigent conditions to go forward with this. It is at an enterprise level, at the entire biggest picture, the least risky, best safety activity considering all of the Department of Energy. But it once again emphasizes to us that we can't let up on our efforts to continuously improve the safety, both in terms of the physical controls, our administrative controls, at PF4 and every one of our hazardous facilities, because I would like to say, but I can't, that this will be the last time we use exigent conditions. But it certainly, puts another element to our motivation to continue to do these improvements, and we'll talk more about the state of our current improvements at PF4 throughout this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. And frankly, Administrator Ruby, you know this better than I do, but I'm guessing this won't be the last emergent mission that you face. And so one of our questions is, are there lessons learned or considerations as a result of this experience that may allow you to have, be able to make better risk decisions the next time?
Yeah, thank you. What I would say, by definition, surprises are surprises, but the concept that we're working towards, this that I mentioned in my opening statement, that's also in the nuclear posture review, of a resilient infrastructure really is in part about this. What can we do to create, as we're spending significant amount of money, as we're revitalizing our facilities, can we think about how to be more resilient, not only to mission, but to safety and security and other issues and so we are working hard to try to think more forward about the things that we do today. What we've learned in the enterprise is what we do today is around for 50 years. I mean, you could pick a number, sometimes 40, sometimes, 70, but it's around a long time. And so we really need to think not only in the near term, but in the long term about the potential uses of the facilities, and that's what we're trying, and that's how we're trying to respond to these surprises.
I appreciate that. And although you weren't here, we hearkened back to, as Mr. Rossetti went through kind of the historical perspective, the discussions and the commitments that were made about upgrading glove boxes and how that tended to wane and probably would have put you in a much better position now. So all we can do is try to do better, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Connery.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Yeah, along those lines on resilient infrastructure, obviously the more robust your building is, the more you have safety class systems, the more, when these surprises come up, you're ready to deal with them and not have to put yourself in a higher risk position, such as the glove box upgrades that we've been talking about for a number of years now that Ms. Roberson just discussed. So as we're discussing how NNSA could reduce the risk at PF4 operations, one major step that we've been talking about is upgrading the active confinement ventilation system. LANL modeled the effects of these upgrades and found that the doses to the public would be substantially smaller if this were done. As Mr. Rossetti indicated earlier, NNSA is currently relying on a passive confinement strategy for earthquake accidents at PF4. PF4 is something of an outlier in this regard. Other DOE facilities with comparable hazards tend to use active confinement ventilation systems, not passive, as a safety control for the bounding earthquake scenarios. Previously, NNSA's plan had been to upgrade to the active confinement ventilation system to safety class. At one point, they even had a line item funding for doing so, but the funding sources changed, and this was still NNSA's plan as recently as 2020 when Mr. McConnell and others briefed the board, as shown in Exhibit 16. But as we noted in March of 2022, the letter indicated that the safety class system was no longer the goal, and we understand that budget situations change and priorities changed. But Administrator, we're still concerned about the lack of the safety class active ventilation system, given the work that's going to be performed and potential work that could be performed, as we just outlined with the exigent circumstances situation. Can you address the change in position and why you feel confident that you don't need a safety class ventilation system at this point.
Yeah, let me start, and then I think it would also be good for Tom Mason to make some follow-on comments about this. So with respect to the active confinement ventilation and passive confinement ventilation, what we are trying to do is balance the best use of taxpayers' dollars, our ability to deliver, and across the enterprise, right? So I think that the calculations that have been done, the thought that has gone into this, I mean, maybe this is sort of a bit, that our approach is a bit of a hybrid system, you know, actually, and maybe Tom can explain that more. So we are going to buy things that help us move later towards active confinement ventilation, but continue to move forward with the passive confinement with other upgrades that we feel are significantly increasing the safety in an adequate way. And again, you know, lots to balance here, but you know, our approach is to make sure that we can do this balancing act that keeps us as safe as possible, best uses of, you know, public dollars, and balance our budget across the entire enterprise, not all in one facility. And so with that, maybe Tom can spend a little bit of time explaining more about how we made this decision.
Yeah, happy to, and Ted may want to chime in as well. I think it's important to keep in mind that PF4 relies on both passive and active confinement systems, and both of which meet the DOE orders and standards. And I know the board understands this, but for members of the public, you know, within the hierarchy of controls, actually, whenever possible, we like to take advantage of passive systems because they rely on fundamental physical principles like gravity and natural convection to do their jobs. And obviously with active systems, you have to go to great lengths to ensure that they remain operable. So we use active systems when the passive systems by themselves are not adequate, but there is a preference to rely on passive systems as a sort of superior mechanism for ensuring safety. You know, we are working now and will be shortly completing an increase in the seismic performance of the fire suppression system, which is going to significantly reduce the off-site dose, which is the thing that we're seeking to mitigate, and in fact provides for us a very effective and also much more rapid improvement in that safety consequence. So as the administrator said, really the goal here is to identify the most effective, shortest path to significant improvements in safety, and we believe the fire suppression system upgrade represents a good portion of that. In addition, the update to the DSA that has been mentioned previously will be able to take into account a number of other improvements that have occurred within the facility, which should further, you know, mitigate that off-site dose. So our approach is to try and, as I said, as in as timely a way as possible, achieve the maximum safety benefit and make sure that the significant investments that are being made are targeted in the way that most effectively accomplishes that task. And I think Ted may also want to add a few comments because obviously with the field office, we have had a lot of discussion on this topic.
Thank you, Tom. And yeah, I'd sort of like to add in, sort of tying the first two questions together a little bit too. And as you stated, you know, the PF4 is a super important facility for the next several decades. And we have 6 major plutonium mission records, being done in PF4. And as a safety basis approval authority, as a field office manager, for this activity, I look at each individual mission through its safety basis as well as the holistic view. With respect to confinement ventilation, PF4 over the last decades, we've improved, made significant investments to upgrade the structure of PF4, for seismic events. As Tom mentioned, not only the passive and active confinement systems, which both meet DOE orders and standards, specifically the safety class passive confinement system, as well as the safety significant active confinement ventilation. And then as Tom pointed out, with the upgrades to the fire suppression system, the safety class, as well as the pit production glove box upgrades to safety class. But key in all this is the work that we're doing now to upgrade the PF4 document safety analysis, currently being revised to the DOE standard 3009-2014. And this is probably one of the few facilities that will have this upgraded safety basis, which will upgrade all the analysis. And so this is really going to be our driver to identify the appropriate safety controls for the safe execution of the pit production, as well as the other plutonium mission of records in PF4. And with respect to the ventilation system, note that we're actually replacing a lot of the specific components. It won't be a safety class system, but the components, that we're replacing a lot of them, including control systems, the structural ventilation system, the diesel generator and power supplies, as well as the exhaust and bleed-off fans. So a lot of those are, already being updated, and we're going to do an incremental, deliberate set of improvements, as we have to replace some of the electrical components, as well as ductwork.
Thank you for that. And I just want to make a comment on the passive confinement system that you've talked about, and obviously making sure the structure stands is very important. And we've had a lot of dialogue over the years about seismic upgrades, and the laboratory has done a significant amount of work in that area that the board has been very pleased with. It took a long time. And also the DSA, it will be great to have a 2014 compliant DSA, although it's a little bit disappointing that we don't have more of those in the complex, considering the 2014 part of that. So I don't want to harp on this too much longer, because I know we have a lot of other things to cover. But when it comes to the pit production, we noted that Savannah River is also going to have a pit facility. It's going to be, it has the benefit of being a quasi new build, as you're refurbishing another building that was supposed to be used for another purpose, and we won't mention that situation. But in that pit facility, the intent is for a safety class active confinement ventilation system credited to mitigate the bounding earthquake. And Savannah River pit facility, as far as I know, is only going to be for pit production, whereas PF4 is not only for pit production, but as we noted, is the Plutonium Center of Excellence, as we've been told, and there's a lot of other missions there. So our, you can choose to answer or not. I know you guys have a lot more considerations to make than we do, since we only focus on safety, but there seems to be an inconsistency there where a single purpose facility will have an active seismically rated confinement ventilation system, but this facility won't. Or it sounds now like you're saying it may eventually, as we incrementally increase the parts and pieces that we're upgrading.
Yeah, I appreciate the seeming inconsistency. My perspective is that with respect to the ventilation system for Savannah River Pit Production Facility, we get to start from square one. And, we're committed to doing, everything we can to do that, again, to look for the future as safely as possible. And we can do it within the time frame expected for the construction of that facility and its commitments to our delivery. In PF4, we have a more difficult situation that again, to the comments that Tom made, we are trying to get the most safety in the most time, critical manner and cost-effective manner. It would be a very significant activity and upgrade, just like, any remodel is harder than a new build in certain ways, and this is one of those ways. So so while I understand it presents sort of a theoretical inconsistency, it has to do with the practical manner that we get to build Savannah River Pit Production Facility ventilation system from the ground up.
I appreciate that you're not just remodeling the home, you also have house guests at the same time, so I appreciate the analogy. I'm going to turn to Ms. Roberson for the next questions.
Thank you, Chair Connery. So I want to continue just a little bit more on the topic of passive confinement at PF4. The most challenging accident is the Boundin earthquake, followed by a fire. Mr. Rossetti explained how the primary safety control for this accident is a passive confinement system. Make sure I remember that right. And relies on the door being closed after a certain amount of time. The longer the doors are open, the more material escapes and the greater the radiation dose to the public. Triad models this situation to determine how much of the radiation material escapes from the facility, and this is called the leak path factor. Thus, an essential assumption in this model is the amount of time the exit doors remain open. And let me pause here and say, I want to thank you both. We had the opportunity to walk through the facility yesterday. It was very cordial. We appreciate the time that was provided to us. And also, while we are learning from your staffs, we also had the opportunity to pay attention to the conditions in the facility. And there are physical conditions in the facility that may complicate the evacuation and time the doors remain open. PF4 has ducting and other equipment that are not qualified to survive the Boundin earthquake. For example, there's overhead ventilation ducting that may fall, as shown in the left side in Exhibit 17. And so, oftentimes there are carts, lots of carts, and unsecured tube boxes in the hallways, as shown in the center and right pictures respectively. Additionally, not all the emergency lights are qualified to function after a Boundin earthquake, meaning the facility might be dark in places as workers try to leave. So Mr. Mason, the one question I had is, we know you're staffing up a lot. Do you have what's your sense of what's the peak number of workers you expect to be inside PF4?
Let's see, right now we have about 1,000 daily occupancy, although we have spread that out in time by going to 24/7 operations. Actually, because of the congestion that you both mentioned and observed, that number will grow, although we will continue to make use of these extended hours, particularly to separate the production operations and the installation operations so that it does mitigate that. In terms of the 5-minute criteria, I should emphasize that's just not an analytical number. We actually do drills. And in fact, I know that emergency preparedness is not one of the topics for today's session, but I would say in the world of emergency preparedness, drills are of significant importance. And in fact, that means we have data. And we know that we're more like 2 minutes or 2.5, factor of 2.5 below the 5-minute for the evacuation time. So there is margin built into that analysis. In addition, we have over 300 emergency lights. You mentioned the emergency lighting in the facility that comply with the life safety requirements, such as the National Fire Protection Association and OSHA standards. And the most crucial ones are fully rated seismic lights to PC3 in the corridors, specifically to facilitate that prompt evacuation. The remaining lights have some seismic capacity and would meet the PC2 requirements. And actually, we do have plans, and we're continuing to replace emergency lights with the PC3 seismically qualified lighting to facilitate that safe evacuation. In addition, after the evacuation is complete, the confinement doors close automatically. That door closure is a credited component of the confinement system. And finally, as part of our emergency response procedures, there's a verification that the doors are closed to ensure that that happens. So we do have confidence in that analysis and that element of the factor, the leak path factor that you mentioned.
So it's very helpful, and thank you. We are aware, and maybe we're wrong, that there is an effort to do some additional modeling to either confirm that's sufficient time or determine if more or less. Is that still ongoing? I think it's called Pathfinder.
That's correct.
That is, okay, okay. And will that consider like emergency responders coming into the building as well as the people leaving the building?
I think that's probably one of those things that we ought to take advantage of your offer to enter things into the record rather than winging it.
That would be great. And then the last thing, you mentioned that there's confirmation that the door is closed. And one of the questions we had was, is that someone going to the door to confirm, or is there a electronic signal that the door is closed? Do you guys monitor the air delta between in and out? Are there remote signals that would validate the passive confinement is active?
So what I was referencing is the fact that as a part of our emergency response procedures, the doors are verified to be closed by operations personnel. So it's a positive verification as part of those emergency response procedures.
Do you know if you guys do plan any indicators on air difference or any remote indicators on the doors? That's not in the plan right now?
We do have indication available of pressure differential readings, so there is instrumentation to support that, and we would be happy to provide further details to the board on that matter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Oh, I just got a new question. Got to ask this because this is the information we got, that the drills that have been performed involved everyone standing by outside the rooms waiting to evacuate. Does that sound familiar to you?
I think we do a variety of drills, and in fact, one thing that we'll be adding next year where we're planning to is we're also going to be incorporating drills during the back shift, which will be a new thing for us. So we try and evaluate, the procedures under a variety of different scenarios, including expansion to the back shift.
So more to come.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Connery.
Thank you, ma'am. Don't worry, Tom's time is coming. I noticed that Mr. Summers hasn't had a lot of questions, but this is just the order of how we divided up the questions. So you stressed the importance of the fire suppression system, and we'd like to understand how that's going to work in a bounding earthquake and fire. So in the postulated scenario, the public would could receive a dose from two different sources. One would be the radioactive material spilling, and the other, the material burning. These two components add up to just below the DOE evaluation guidelines of 25 rem. In NNSA's response to our November 2021 letter, which we're showing in Exhibit 18, You noted that the dose consequences would be lowered to 7 rem once the fire suppression system is upgraded to the appropriate seismic qualification. This assumes that even though the fire could loft radioactive particles into the air, that the fire suppression system will completely remove those particles from the air. Our concern is that the sprinklers in PF4, which are shown on the right side of the Exhibit 18, are just like what you'd see in the store and would not perform as robustly as we think that has been indicated by your calculations. So, and this is, I'm going to address this to the administrator, but you can, choose to pick who answers it if you wouldn't care to. But you have already committed to this strategy, and we want to understand the basis for the decision. So that's why we're asking these questions. So would you or Mr. McConnell want to discuss what actions NNSA took to ensure the validity of those dose mitigation values of 7 rem? Because we got the letter, we understood what you were saying, but we didn't see any of the evidence that validated the 7 rem.
Sure. So, great question, and you point out sort of a distinction between an analytical portion of the overall response, and then, which is sort of an iterative loop, right? You go to the real world, you collect the data, you take that information, put it into models, assuming a certain fire with a certain intensity in a certain area or in worst case part of the facility, and then assume some amount of fire suppression. As we all know, or perhaps don't all know, only the sprinklers that are in the vicinity of the heat are going to actually go off. That's the way sprinkler systems work. So you model some heads going off and some not. And then that model produces a number. That's the only way to get that number. But your point then is to go back and make sure that the assumptions that were critical to the model are reflected in the real world. And I don't know where this particular sprinkler head is. I suspect that in the not too distant future, we're going to find it. But it is just one of many. I wouldn't hazard to guess how many sprinkler heads are in PF4. But we have an obligation then to make sure that the reality of the facility, whether it's, I'm not a fire protection engineer, it is a very complicated field, and so I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. But the fundamental point you have here is the real world systems actually installed, maintained? Is there been over time some interference put there that would cause us to question whether or not the assumptions in that model still hold? That's part of our normal quality assurance, and so it happened as part of us getting to the point where we would accept this model as useful information. But the world keeps changing, the facility keeps changing. We need to make sure we stay on top. I suspect in a little while we're going to talk about oversight. This is one of those key points where we need to continuously be vigilant to make sure that the physical world in PF4 meets our expectations so that we could make sure that those models remain valid.
Yeah, I guess the
That was a
point,
part of the question that I don't think we addressed, which is how did we, NNSA, look at the models that we got from Triad? Was that what you were going to follow up on?
well, it's so more to the point. So the question was about the confinement ventilation system. That's what the letter was about. And you responded and said, hey, we understand that this is what you want. To your point, it's very difficult to put the active confinement ventilation system, PF3, into the facility. However, we are relying on a safety class fire protection system to basically do the job in conjunction with the passive confinement ventilation system that Dr. Mason spoke of. So, okay, that sounds like you have a path forward that gives you confidence that we're going to be able to protect below the evaluation guidelines. So what was curious was that the number was very precise. It went from 25 to 7, but we didn't see any of the data, whatever model you were using, either the inputs or the calculations that got you to the 7 rem. So that's the question, and you're obviously not going to be able to answer that from the dais.
I think I would like to see if Ted Wyka could add some information here. Thanks.
Well, I would like to add a little bit, and not restating the systems that we already have in place, the fire suppression, glove box, seismic upgrades, the, safety class confinement system. But this is where your staff is also helping out a lot, because we've had very rigorous discussions back and forth over the last several months on leak path factor. This analysis is actually a key input into our DSA that we're updating, the 2009-2014 DSA. And part of that process is using the models that are available to us with this input from the MailCore, the CFD, and MCAS, different model versions to help us analyze, our and technically defend our models. And that'll, again, address, what systems and the adequacy of our systems.
I appreciate that. I think, again, you can submit for the record if there's documentation behind that analysis that will help us understand how you got to that point, because, again, I wasn't denigrating the sprinkler system. The sprinkler system is what it is. I just was pointing out that it's not a deluge system. You are upgrading it, which we are very happy about. You're upgrading the fire protection loop so that the water gets to PF4 when it needs to. It's just that if the assumption is that all of the radiation gets knocked down, to use a colloquialism, then we don't see that happening for precisely the system which you mentioned.
Well, and obviously this model gets very complicated, and we will provide the information. But part of this, just to help, is you talked about two ways that material would, right, the stuff that falls. It's in the building. There has to be some reason for it to leave, right? So it falls. It just like if somebody were to knock over some talcum powder, there would be a puff. And that puff would then aerosolize material that would flow with the air out, presumably, although the building normally operates with the lowest pressure in the building. A fire, the heat of the fire generates, from a first principles physics perspective, generates energy, and that energy heats the air, and the air then is the second reason why material would move out. So part of the model is that the sprinkler system cools the fire. The fire doesn't provide as much energy, which doesn't provide a driving force to force the puff of material to go out the door. It's not that the particles bond to the water and fall out. But I just wanted to make sure everybody, there's a lot of physics. Thank goodness we have the Los Alamos National Laboratory, but we need to provide you that those models have been validated, and then we have to apply them to the specifics of our facility, quality check them with you have talented people that can do these things just as we can, and we need to get you that level of information.
I appreciate that. And again, I'm not trying to badger the witness at this point in time. I'm just trying to make it clear what it is that we're looking for. So if we get an answer like that, which is fine, it's within your purview to provide us with that answer. We just want to understand, the kind of the show your work thing so that we can evaluate it. We do have a fire protection engineer here as a resident inspector, and that's not by accident. So we recognize the hazards in the facility. So I will shut up for, oh no, actually I have the next question, sorry. So this goes to modeling. And in recent years, we've noticed that the laboratory is increasing efforts on analytical modeling, which you are quite adept at. And these efforts have been used to justify what we would consider deficiencies in engineered safety systems, rather than identifying or rectifying the actual deficiencies. So colloquially, we say you pencil whip the issue rather than addressing it. So probably the biggest example is this PF4 leak path factor calculation that Mr. Wyka was just speaking of and we mentioned earlier. And we can show you the complexity of the approach in Exhibit 19. It involves multiple models, numerous assumptions, some of which are difficult to defend or protect with controls, just as we discussed. So we understand that you're upgrading physical systems. This isn't glossing over those efforts. We know the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the seismic upgrades. We understand the replacements. We saw the replacements on some of the ventilation systems and some of this fire protection when we were in PF4 yesterday. However, we do see this trend where time and resources are increasingly devoted to modeling away the problem instead of improving the physical system. So Dr. Mason, can you comment on the focus on the modeling to justify the acceptance of deficiencies rather than increasing efforts to physically improve the physical systems?
I would say I do not view modeling in quite the way that you described. You know, our current documented safety basis and the update that we're working on really relies heavily on engineered systems. And, you know, these include the sorts of things that you talked about, glove box support stands and, you know, heat source encapsulation, fire suppression systems, and so forth. The role of modeling is really to support the analyses. In fact, we just talked about, you know, one worked example in terms of how does the fire suppression system mitigate the off-site dose. We have to use the models to translate the impact of those engineered systems to determine whether or not they're getting the safety that we want. And you know, we don't deploy engineered systems or even administrative controls without understanding how they're going to get us the desired outcome. There would be little value in that approach. So, you know, I don't view models as a way of somehow avoiding a necessary, you know, safety system or engineered system. I actually view modeling as essential to validating that we've got them right. You know, we obviously at Los Alamos, we use models heavily, not just in safety, but we actually use them to assist us in the annual assessment and certification of the stockpile, which I would argue is a fairly high consequence activity. But you know, those models are very grounded in real physical systems and real measurements and the impacts of those measurements. And I don't really view it any different. It's really, you know, it's a wonderful capability that we have that allows us to be really smart in how we build, operate, and maintain the systems. And I don't know, Ted may want to add something on this topic.
I think you pretty much summed it up, Tom, but, you know, again, and we're going to, it's like a do loop. We're using this information from the modeling to feed back into our DSA to make sure we're in a complete defensible position. And that's using all three elements, you know, the MCAS, the MCOR, and the CFD, so multiple models, you know, with the leak pack factor information.
I would just add that I take your point that if the only response you get is we modeled it and it's okay, it's frustrating. So I guess I would just say that from my side, that when that's the response, we'll just have another meeting to say, do we really mean this, and are we sure about this? Because I can appreciate how that, you know, the frustration on the other side, especially if you don't have a lot of insight into the exact models. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you, Administrator. I think you appreciate the question for what I wasn't trying to denigrate the modeling, and obviously the stockpile stewardship program is a great example of how we use modeling for national security reasons. And again, we have a small staff of dedicated folks, and we're just trying to understand how it is that you're approaching these issues. So I'm actually going to turn to Mr. Summers for the next question.
Thanks, Chair Connery. Dr. Mason and Mr. Weicker, you both just eloquently said how important the documented safety analysis is. And as PF4 ramps up mission work, it will be important for Triad and NNSA to update the safety analysis accordingly and to implement modern DOE standards for that analysis. The history of making timely improvements to safety basis documents at LANL has not been encouraging in the past. For example, the last major safety basis upgrade effort for PF4 took more than 4 years to get approved. The current initiative to upgrade the safety basis to meet modern standards began, I believe, around 2017. Considerable work remains to complete the new analysis, as is shown and seen here in Exhibit 20. After Triad completes the analysis, an NSA will need to review and approve it, and then it will need to be implemented into the facility operations. So, Dr. Mason, what has been done to overcome Triad's past struggles and challenges with safety basis document development?
So when Triad first came to Los Alamos as part of the transition in 2018, actually one of the things that we heard very loud and clear from the field office colleagues at the time was there was frustration with both the timeliness and the quality of many of the submissions that we, the lab, make to the field office, actually not just on safety basis, but on a wide variety of different topics, everything from real estate packages to procurement packages to safety documentation. So that was something that we had on our plate front and center coming in. And I'll try and tell you a little bit about how we've approached dealing with it, and I'll leave it to Ted to assess, the extent to which things have improved. So one of the things that we did right up front was actually go through an exercise to go through and list all of the deliverables that we had. Because, one reason for things being late, and if you're scrunched for time, that often leads to poor quality, so there's a relationship there. And so we wanted to make sure that we were tracking everything so that we could ensure that we weren't scrambling at the last minute for something that had slipped through the cracks. The other thing that we've worked pretty hard on was having a better understanding up front of exactly what the expectation was for the deliverable. I mean, obviously, we have to respect the different roles for us as the laboratory, as contractors, and the field office, who have, in the cases of safety documentation, safety basis, an oversight and an approval authority. But on the other hand, having a clear understanding of what is needed for them to do their job allows us to deliver better quality documentation. I would say that we have made progress in that regard. I think certainly we are doing better in terms of both, I think, timeliness and quality, although, our safety basis organization is young. And so we are adding new staff and we have people who are developing, and so that's why having that upfront understanding is particularly important. I should note that we have met all the deliverables associated with the safety basis documentation for the Los Alamos plutonium pit production project. And so I would take that as an indicator of progress in this area. And maybe I'll turn it over to Ted to give you his assessment of where we are in our journey of improving.
Thank you, Tom. And, speaking as the field office manager as well as the safety basis approval authority, Tom is right. Since I've been here, the quality and the timeliness of documents has dramatically improved. In fact, that'll be in the performance evaluation review that Tom will see in the near future. There were 70 products that were developed over the last several months, and okay, thank you. And so there were specifically 70 documents that we looked at, so it's a pretty big population. One of the things, this is also like a partnership as well. Partnership, understanding when there's a federal inherent responsibility. The partnership is that our teams meet once a month at least, maybe even a couple weeks now. And they do like a 30, 60-day review. They look at where are we at with all these documents, and that helps sort of with the expectation issue and providing the comments. So there's a lot of good dialogue between the two teams, recognizing our specific roles and responsibilities. And reason why it's a partnership too is because we have a big role in that to make sure that we adequately approve those. And one is making sure that we have the right staffing. And with our headquarters leadership, we were able to actually fill up our nuclear safety staff, full capabilities, as well as pretty much for the entire site office. But we're also leveraging the entire enterprise. It's not just, we're not here on an island. It's all about the enterprise. And so we use expertise across the enterprise. Have other field offices and headquarters to help us with these safety basis reviews so that we take independent look at quality of these documents as well. So it's a team effort, partnership, that's required, recognizing our individual responsibilities.
Thank you both for your answers. Dr. Mason, given the complexity of the safety basis upgrade that's underway and the challenges that LANL has previously experienced with implementing new safety bases, can you discuss whether PF4 will be operating under a modern safety basis by 2026, which is when NSA is required or expected to be able to make 30 pits per year?
I think you have the timeline up there. So, that's certainly our objective. Obviously, that gets us to the point of submittal, and then we'll have to see how things go in terms of approval and, any feedback that we get and so forth. But that is what we're working towards.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Chair Connery.
I think the next set of questions is from Ms. Roberson.
Thank you, Chair Connery. So, yeah, that doesn't include approval nor implementation, right?
Yeah, so your point being that once the department, once an NSA TED approves it, then we have a document that has to go back to the laboratory to train their people, revise their procedures.
Right.
So that the day-to-day operations are compliant with that DSA.
So-
That's part of that timeline.
Yes, that's the basis of our question, really, is the complete process. I want to take a moment, and I know Administrator Ruby is going to say, didn't I already answer that? But can we just back up and go back over for a minute and look at the big picture and recap some of what we discussed so far? In just a few years, PF4 will see a paradigm shift to a large-scale production facility with the largest number of workers in its history. NNSA is investing billions of dollars in production-related infrastructure, but has expressed reluctance to invest in upgrading certain safety infrastructure. As we've discussed, a safety class active confinement ventilation system would be one of the most effective controls for protecting the public from accidents at PF4. And yet, for the foreseeable future, PF4 will continue to rely on a passive confinement strategy, which has some uncertainties. Additionally, while we recognize NNSA is upgrading the fire suppression and other safety systems, we are concerned that the sprinklers might be less effective than predicted. In addition to all this, we're concerned that the risks of schedule slip associated with the Savannah River pit facility, given NNSA's difficulties with bringing new facilities online, could be a factor. In Exhibit 21, we have an excerpt from the legislation that requires DOE to produce 80 pits per year by 2030. The current plan, as we understand it, and as you've stated, is that 50 of those are meant to be produced at the Savannah River pit facility. However, if that facility schedule slips, there could be additional pressure for PF4 to take on additional scope. And so just in light, I know we asked you this in the beginning, we'll ask you again. Could you discuss why you believe that your investment in safety-related infrastructure is adequate, given the impending mission increase at PF4 and the greater than zero potential of greater production stress on PF4 with delays at Savannah River?
Yeah, thank you. I think, let me just say, let me start on this issue of production increases required at Los Alamos, and then back to the beginning of your question. We are working very, very closely with the Department of Defense to relook at requirements. This was a requirement that was set not necessarily, not because it could be done, but because it was a calculation of their needs. We have to relook. I mean, it's just life. There's nothing that I would rather do than meet all of the requirements, but we have to relook it because of the issues that we've experienced. And by the way, not just, I mean, in NNSA, but not just in NNSA, this is a very difficult time in the United States of America to do large construction projects. It's hard to get workers. It's hard to get supplies. There's a lot of downtime for COVID. I mean, the list goes on. So we are trying to do things at a difficult time. We're trying to be as honest and realistic as possible about what we can do and can't do, and we're working very closely with the Department of Defense so that scenario you laid out won't happen. Because we cannot commit to more, I mean, in a sincere way, to more than 30 pits per year from PF4, especially as we're getting started. So, this is a work in progress. There's a lot of things, as you probably can imagine, that have to be thought about in terms of changing things and making sure our nuclear deterrent is second to none. But we're working it very, very hard. We are, I mean, the statements that we made early on about safety and the way we're viewing it is, do buy down risk that we can do in the timeframes that fit the rest of the things that we need as effectively as possible, do things that position us to do more in the future and to continuously improve. That's the philosophy we're using, and I feel like we are very careful about the risks that we're accepting. We're not just saying, we got this mission to do, we got to accept risk. We're approaching this in, I think, a very responsible manner. But it does mean that, we can't stop. We don't think it's worth stopping for the 3 years or whatever would be required because to get to active confinement ventilation. But we're doing lots of other things to make sure things are safe. Of course.
So one aspect of the question is the mix of things or the potential change of things that would go on in PF4 in the future. As you're well aware, one of the fundamental first assumptions or first data points of our approach is something called material at risk. So we say there's this much plutonium in PF4 available to be involved in an accident like this post-seismic fire, regardless of what activity we are pursuing to use that much plutonium. And that is one of our most fundamental controls, as you're well aware, that we track very carefully to make sure we stay below our total material at risk. If the things we are doing with that, from a programmatic perspective change, the MAR limit stays the same. So unless we found ourselves, I'm going to point it out before you do, right? We get some exigent condition, like with 238. Mm-hmm. The control here would be the material at risk, because that's how we get to, going back to your last slide, that's part of all that math that ends up with a consequence number that is how we regulate. So we would be we are currently very well aware that it's entirely likely that PF4 is or could become oversubscribed. And what we would then have to do is decide amongst all the things that the Plutonium Center of Excellence does, that would fall to the administrator to decide which of those things, sort of fall off if we had to make space to do more of something else.
Okay. Well, thank you, because my next question was just to ask if you were, because we know it would buy you margin, and if you're comfortable with the decisions that have been made on upgrading systems, and it sounds like the other side would be just not to do other things, have to prioritize. So I appreciate that. Is that right? That's
Yes, and I just want to, re-emphasize that this decision is being made in, all these decisions about priorities will be made and are being made in consultation with the Department of Defense and other important partners, right? So that we're balancing all the various things, that we're trying not to be surprised.
Thank you. Thank you, Administrator.
Okay, next question to Mr. Summers.
Thank you, Chair Connery. Mr. Wyka, in our 2019 letter to the Secretary of Energy, we identified safety system deficiencies and weaknesses and analysis that support PF4's safety basis. This letter was issued to help aid the development of the upgraded safety basis. First question, sir. Your predecessor directed Triad to consider the board's concerns and respond in writing back to your office, the field office. We see it in the expanded text identified here in Exhibit 22. Would you please discuss what actions resulted as a result of this letter?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I'm not specific, and I'll probably have to get back to you for the record on specific items made with respect to this letter. But just as a matter of practice, whenever we receive any letters and information, whether it's from your resident inspectors or board letters, several examples like the transportation safety documentation for on-site, as well as the letter that was provided for the Idaho heat sources, and I'm sure the same with this letter. This is one thing I'll pass out to our staff and send over to our M&O partners as well. And what things are we missing? Are there any safety issues here, that we need to address? So these are, documents, letters, that, we get out there to see what real-time improvements that we can make. This obviously part of my time, but I'll get back to you for the record on what actual changes were made with respect to this letter.
Thank you, Mr. Wyka. And second question, the board has recently communicated advice in other regards, in other letters regarding Los Alamos, of course. For example, on August 11th, 2022, provided advice on actions that could be taken in order to strengthen the safety posture during the heat source plutonium that we have discussed several times now earlier. Would you discuss any actions that you have planned regarding the advice in regards to heat source plutonium?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. And that was the example of the letter I was talking about as well, and it was provided to the department as a letter of information without a reporting action, but it had a lot of good information in there. And so I directed my staff working with the LANL team to go through each paragraph of the letter and figure out what changes, we should be making to our processes that we have in place, for the handling of, heat source activity. And I think we've already discussed controls that we have in place for that, but what are we missing? And with that letter, there was dialogue between the staff, your staff as well as my staff as well, to identify those areas. And I can provide the specific examples again to the record of, we did make a few changes, to our processes as a result of, the information that was provided by the board.
Thank you, Mr. Wyka. Certainly would appreciate receiving that. Over to you, Ms. Chair Connery.
Ms. Robertson.
I was just going to do a follow-up, make sure we were clear. We know this is an outstanding reporting requirement, but we're interested in, not just because it's an outstanding reporting requirement to us, but because this is a reporting requirement to you. And so that's what we're trying to understand. Maybe we haven't gotten a response yet, but maybe you had. So we appreciate the follow-up.
So we actually are coming to the conclusion of this session, and we're going to give you a little bit of a break. But before we break, I just want to let you know that the nature of our questions is not to frustrate you. Clearly they do. We have sent letters for a long time to Los Alamos, even to your predecessors, about things that concern us. We don't always get answers. We understand that we're not always going to get answers we like. We understand, Administrator, that you have a number of things that you're balancing when it comes to requirements that are put upon you by somebody else. And we have the luxury of only looking at safety. And there aren't very many of us. We are at currently 112 individuals who are looking across the entire complex. And so the frustration level that you might hear from our side is that when we ask the questions, and we're asking honest questions to get at issues, we don't get the same response from the NNSA side of LANL that we might get from EM side of LANL. Because for whatever reason, it takes a longer time for us to get the answers that we need in order to understand what's happening. And the more we understand, the less, hopefully the fewer questions that we're going to ask. So that's the nature of our questioning, and it's not designed to be adversarial. We know you have an important mission to do, but when you say, Mr. McConnell, that, you know, the MAR conversation that we just had, well, for years we've been saying you have glove boxes that aren't seismically qualified, that have material in them that are at risk because you don't seismically qualify them. So it's really frustrating to say, well, we'll figure it out if we have additional mission that will create additional MAR at risk. But we already know that there's things that you could do now to alleviate that situation later on. So that's, if you hear frustration, that's what you're hearing from our side. But I do want to make sure that we have a time for a break. So my suggestion is that we reconvene at about 5 minutes to 6, and then we will continue with the rest of our panel. And the same for our audience. Please return back at 5 minutes to 6, and we will resume. Thank you.